Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. We add two nonfiction books to our native bookshelf today. In Unsettling Territory, author Douglas Metoxen Keel recounts his tribe's growth in sovereignty and power to regain land swindled from them in the early 20th century. And Sons of Gunshooter relooks at the murder of a prominent trader more than a century ago. Authors Dorothy Denetclaw and Matt Fitzsimmons offer new perspectives using archived records and in-person interviews. These authors join us after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. Microgrids can be a lifeline in remote areas prone to power outages, according to local and tribal leaders in Northern California. Leaders spoke at an event on energy security in an era of wildfires, drought, and sea level rise, all linked to climate change. Suzanne Potter has more.
Dr. Arnie Jacobson, director of the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt, says microgrids often involve solar panels plus battery storage.
So during normal operation, they're connected to the regional grid and they can export power and generate revenue. And during a regional grid outage, they operate in island mode and can provide resilience energy services.
Microgrids have gained popularity in recent years as utilities have had to shut off power intermittently during wildfires and high wind events. Jacobson adds that the Willow Creek and Hoopa substations and their associated circuits in the Humboldt area are frequently on the top 10 list of least reliable circuits in the state. Beth Burks, who directs the Redwood Coastal Energy Authority, says its microgrid serves as backup power to the airport and kept it online for 15 hours in December 2022 when an earthquake knocked out power.
We're all familiar with how important it is to keep the airport going. We do our emergency medical transport out of there. And the Coast Guard serves 250 miles of search and rescue territory. And again, we can keep them going when we go into islanding.
Islanding is the term for a system that can kick in and power a local area when the main utility grid goes down. Heidi Moore-Geinup with the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe says its microgrid saved the day during the 2022 blackout, keeping several tribal buildings running so they could provide ice, gas, medical care, and lodging.
We want to be known as a safe place to go, the island in times of despair. We're a very small rural community, but we are engaged in technological advances that can help rural, global energy access.
I'm Suzanne Potter.
Ketchikan-based artist Savannah Lucornu was selected as this year's poster artist for the Alaska Folk Festival in Juneau. The annual spring event seeks art submissions from Alaska creatives. For festival merchandise, including a poster, KRBD's Hunter Morrison sat down with her to discuss how the opportunity will help expand representation of Indigenous artists throughout Alaska.
Could you tell me a little bit about, sort of what inspires your work as an artist?
I'm part of 3 different tribes. I'm Tsimshian, Haida, and Nez Perce. So a lot of my inspiration comes from the art styles of my tribes, as well as my family, surroundings, environment, friends, that kind of thing.
And could you tell me a little bit more about, what mediums of art that you sort of specialize in?
Yeah, so mainly I draw and I paint. I do a lot of traditional drawing, but I also do digital drawing as well, too, so working with Procreate on my iPad. And then I also do painting, mainly acrylic, but I have, done watercolor here and there.
And, I guess how will this opportunity sort of expand not only your work as an artist, but, sort of expand the celebration of Indigenous people and Indigenous art?
What I'm hoping for with being the artist for this year's Folk Fest is that my art is started to seen more widely throughout Alaska, I suppose. I will say it's not my most obviously Indigenous design. I will say all of my art inherently becomes Indigenous because I am Indigenous, but at the same time, there's no form line in it. There's no traditional Native art in it for this design, but I still hope that means that people look into even my own art and see more of what I do, and that people just explore more of it.
That was Hunter Morrison and Savannah Lucornu. I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Tribal Development Partners believe strong infrastructure strengthens tribal sovereignty. Through the 105L lease program, TDP helps align federal funding systems with long-term tribal priorities. More at tribaldevpartners.com. Proud to support this show. Skugtash. For more than 40 years, Ramona Farms has revived ancient traditional foods. Tepary beans, pinoli, polentas, and more, all from store.ramonafarms.com. Ramona Farms supports this show. Tom Yang.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce, broadcasting today from the studios of KUII Hopi Radio, serving the Hopi Reservation, Flagstaff, Tuba City, Winslow, and the I-40 corridor. Dene writer Dorothy Dennetclaw and journalist Matt Fitzsimons uncover events leading up to the murder trial involving sons of a Navajo spiritual leader in the book The Sons of Gunshooter, a Navajo resistance story. Sifting through archival research and oral stories, the authors arrive at a conclusion that differs from that of the courts and news media of the time. We'll talk with the authors later in the hour. In Wisconsin, the Oneida Nation went from having nearly all of their land stripped from them to being one of the most powerful political and economic entities in the state. In Unsettling Territory, the resurgence of the Oneida Nation in the face of settler backlash, Oneida historian Douglas Metoxen Keel reveals how the tribe turned displacement into opportunity and managed to strengthen and grow their presence in the face of organized opposition. These are two new nonfiction books on our Native bookshelf this month. If you have comments or questions for these authors, you can call us. The number is 1-800-996-2848. That is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now from New Haven, Connecticut is Douglas Metoxen Keel. He is an associate professor of history at Northwestern University and the author of Unsettling Territory, The Resurgence of the Oneida Nation in the Face of Settler Backlash. He's also a citizen of the Oneida Nation. Doug, hello, and welcome to Native America Calling.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, let's get into your book here. You start the book with your family, and specifically your grandmother, Grace Griffey. And tell me a little bit more about your grandmother and why it was important to include your family in this history and the telling of Oneida sovereignty and land reclamation.
Yeah, what I think is an important way to grab readers, to reach beyond academic text, right? To try to reach readers, beyond the immediate community and beyond the profession of Native American history. I feel like personal stories are often the best way to go. And really, the inspiration for me writing this book is an observation about the extraordinary abilities of Oneida women. Small groups of Oneida women banding together and coming up with creative solutions that were the birth of the resurgence that I write about. And in the case of my own grandmother's story, I wanted to highlight just one woman as such an example, but also her story is one in which she moved to Chicago for 51 years and was a really great example of how to connect city and reservation in ways that don't become entirely binary, that treat people as being one or the other, and that she lived a life that was very much in between. And not only that, but she left the reservation during a period in which things were particularly economically challenged, and then she returned home at the end of the 1990s to a place that had been fundamentally transformed. And so the experience that my grandmother lived through of seeing her home community be one that she had to flee in so many ways because it was a place of few opportunities, and Chicago was a place that offered new possibilities. And she found a world in between for many, many years.
Well, that history, the urban migration of the Oneida people, I found that really, really valuable when reading the book, because for your people, urban migration started much sooner than the BIA relocation program in the 1950s. You folks were already migrating to cities back in the 1920s, which is just really astounding to think about. And how did that impact that urban migration in terms of the way tribal members really thought about strengthening the community and building sovereignty within the tribe?
Yeah, you're right that this is something that happens unusually early for the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. The first intertribal organizations developed in Milwaukee was the Consolidated Tribes of American Indians in 1927. So, decades before the BIA formally begins devising a way to send Native people to cities. And Oneidas, are, because of being quite close to Green Bay, actually 14% of the city of Green Bay lies within the boundaries of the reservation. Part of it is, a familiarity with, Green Bay's not a big city, but it certainly is more urban than the reservation is. And Oneida people had spent, decades working in paper mills in Green Bay and such. And so proximity to the city made a move to Milwaukee feel less dramatic. And it was something that felt a little bit more natural. And so, there was a lot of a connection between Milwaukee and Oneida as early as the 1930s, really robust ties back and forth in the community. And in important ways, the way it came to shift our politics is, a great example of the role of urban leaders is that during the termination era, the campaign to resist termination by Oneida Nation leaders was primarily led by folks who were then resident in Milwaukee, but many years earlier had been the founding leaders of the new IRA government during the 1930s.
Mm-hmm. And as you write, the Oneidas forced off their homelands in present-day New York and onto a reservation in Wisconsin. And there were, of course, other Oneida groups as well that were dispersed, some in Canada, some here in the United States. At what point, though, Doug, was the Oneida land base in Wisconsin, when was it the smallest? How many actual acres was it ultimately reduced to at one point?
It's a difficult question to answer in terms of quantifying exactly, but it's as low as 90 acres out of the 65,000 that are the reservation boundaries. The boundaries of our reservation change a lot when we move from New York to Wisconsin, but long story short, the present boundaries of the reservation are 65,000 acres and 400 some. And at its low point in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, it was less than 100 acres. Less than 2% of the land was owned by the Oneida Nation. At this point, it's 45% and climbing. And really, the book is about the nature of that transformation, what makes that happen. And, in so many ways, I felt that it was a story that people perceived as being primarily about gaming, that casino revenues are what allowed for the possibility of buying land back, and it certainly is, but it's a story that began a lot earlier. It's, moments like the New Deal that, present new possibilities for Oneida leaders.
Okay. Well, I definitely want to talk more about, the land back efforts currently in recent history in the last, 20 or 30 years, because that's such a big part of your book. But going back to some of the history here, you highlight 2 really, really interesting figures in Oneida history. And in many ways, they were kind of conflicting types of individuals in terms of what their viewpoints were, their perspectives, and their goals within the Oneida Nation. But the 2 people were Denison Wheelock and Laura Cornelius Kellogg. Tell me more about how these 2 individuals played a huge part in Oneida resurgence in the early 20th century.
Yeah, and this is another good example of how I think focused biographies sometimes make a really complicated past more accessible. And so Denison Wheelock and Laura Cornelius Kellogg are 2 prominent leaders during the early decades of the 20th century. They were both founders, though particularly Laura Cornelius Kellogg, founders of the Society of American Indians, which is the first intertribal Native political organization. It predates the NCAI by several decades, no longer is in existence, but it is an important organization that begins to organize really among the era of boarding school educated Native people, those graduates. And Laura Cornelius Kellogg was proudly not a graduate of the boarding school system. Denison Wheelock was very much a product of it, so much so that he was, he wrote lifelong letters to Richard Henry Pratt at the Carlisle School. He was a pallbearer at his funeral. And at one point when Wheelock was being considered for potentially the role of BIA commissioner, he wrote to Pratt that it would be as if Pratt himself was commissioner of the BIA if Wheelock were to get the position. So Wheelock was very much, product of the boarding school system, and was very much in favor of the pursuit of citizenship as the primary solution to Native concerns and full integration into American society. Laura Cornelius Kellogg had different ambitions, and she was looking to New York to possibly reclaim lands in New York, and inspiring a movement to as we have as you were asking before, we have multiple Oneida communities that are dispersed after the American Revolution. And, this is largely because of the pressures coming from the Erie Canal. And Oneida people get out ahead of the Erie Canal, really. And it's Laura Cornelius Kellogg in the aftermath of allotment in Oneida, Wisconsin. And people are really wondering what the path forward is. And it's a devastating moment. And Laura Cornelius Kellogg says we should be focused on getting our land back in New York. And, of course, there's all kinds of, efforts locally in Wisconsin, but she begins, inspiring a vision to think about the possibilities of land reclamation on a much bigger scale. And it's important that, she sets out a very different vision than Wheelock. That's, decidedly not assimilationist.
Another part of the book that's just so fascinating, because you have Denison Wheelock, who is very actually pro-allotment. He's very pro-assimilation. And then you have Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who's focusing on land claims, and then she has some kind of shady fundraising practices. And it's really interesting to compare how their legacies have aged, and now looking back at, here it is 2026, and thinking back to how these people operated and what their thoughts, what their mindsets were, what their goals were. Really interesting now to compare the legacy. So, Doug, great book. Really enjoyed reading it. We're going to take a short break. We'll come back. We'll continue this conversation. And for any listeners who would like to join us, just pick up your phone and give us a call. We're at 1-800-99-NATIVE. As always, the phone lines are open for listeners who would like to join this conversation. If you had a chance to read one of these books we're talking about today, or maybe you will here shortly, this is a book show, and we always want to encourage folks to pick up some of these great titles by great Native authors and do a little bit of reading. Get cozy with a book at home and spend some time reading. So again, that number is 1-800-99-NATIVE. And we're broadcasting live again today from the studios of KUII Hopi Radio in Second Mesa, Arizona. So listeners, stay with us. I'm Sean Spruce, and we'll be right back. Originally from Greenland, Ayu Peter grew up in a system that didn't value her Inuk culture and language. Over time, she's reclaimed her culture to become a renowned activist, fashion designer, and lawyer focused on protecting indigenous rights. Ayu joins us on the next Native America Calling.
Attention tribal community leaders. The 2026 Tribal Self-Governance Conference takes place this April 7th to the 9th at the Gila River Wild Horse Pass Resort and Casino in Chandler, Arizona. Tribal delegation meetings using AI, Indian Health 101, land stewardship, tribal values-based communications training, understanding the tribal-federal relationship, and more, all at one convening. The full draft agenda and registration are available at tribalselfgov.org, who support this show.
Thanks for listening today to Native America Calling. We're talking with Oneida historian Doug Keel about his new book, Unsettling Territory. It's about his tribe's growth and sovereignty, power, and land, despite setbacks and continued backlash from the government and the tribe's neighbors in Wisconsin. You can join our conversation today. Call 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. And Doug, I want to click ahead now to the present. And what's another really compelling aspect of your book is how you describe the Oneida Nation and as it has evolved and gained more power and expanded its land base, bought back, reacquired a lot of the land that it originally had. It's caused a lot of friction within neighboring communities, specifically the village of Hobart, Wisconsin, and it induces what is described as a dominant group status threat. And explain that to us, because I think there's listeners today from other tribal nations that can probably identify and relate to what you're writing about here.
Yeah, in terms of just defining dominant group status threat, that's about the dominant group in society, white folks perceiving falsely that their place and positionality and power in society is at risk, right? And it provokes a certain kind of anxiety and paranoia and resentment. And where this really comes from in terms of the village of Hobart, it's been a long process of placing lands back into trust, and to explain what it is that sets off the opposition is with every acre that the Oneida Nation buys back, and just to be clear, this is land that's available for sale by private individuals and in the reservation, which is still majority owned by non-native people. And as lands come up for sale, the Oneida Nation buys them and places those lands back into trust. And when they go back into trust, they are no longer part of the local tax base. And ostensibly, the backlash from the village of Hobart is about taxes. They would frame it as when we lose the ability to tax these lands, then our municipal tax base shrinks, and it has a negative effect on our municipality. But there is a solution for that, and they're called service agreements, and tribes have been negotiating these for quite some time. In the case of Oneida Nation, we have service agreements with all of the counties and municipalities that overlap with the reservation. And it's only the village of Hobart that has had a problem with coming to agreement about these service agreements. And what are these service agreements? It's that they're payments in lieu of taxes, right? It's an understanding that if tomorrow a property is placed back into trust, that municipal garbage pickup, for instance, could get really tricky and complicated trying to remember which is a trust property, which isn't, right? And so the nation, makes payments in lieu of taxes to smooth out that kind of process administratively. And the dispute is about power. It's about the fact that the village of Hobart would like to deliver us a tax bill and just say, this is how much you owe us, rather than sit down with the representatives of a legitimate sovereign government and engage in nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationships.
And you write about how there's a lot of money within some communities in Hobart. At one point, NFL player Aaron Rodgers, Green Bay Packers superstar quarterback, owned a home there. What's the current status now between the Oneida Nation and the village of Hobart?
So it's been a long and complicated dispute. And one of the things that has been Hobart's strategy, and they have been tremendously successful at it, is to try to grow the population inside the village and to also inflate the property values as much as possible. So property values in the village of Hobart are now just over $1 billion, right? And so that's to say that they want to raise the price of real estate. That makes it more difficult for the nation to buy back that land. And in many cases, so the village of Hobart it's a wealthy suburb of Green Bay, and again, NFL superstars living there. There's a very big golf course that the nation now owns, and many sort of McMansions that surround this territory. And the village's ambition has been to build and build and build, and they've almost doubled the population in the last 15 years. And again, they have dramatically raised the property values, and that's all their own long-term effort to make it much more difficult for the Oneida Nation to buy back its land. But we will eventually get there. That is the stated goal.
All right. Let's take a caller. This is Nathaniel, who is listening in Eagle Butte, South Dakota on KIPI Radio. Hello, Nathaniel. You are on the air. All righty. I'm not hearing Nathaniel here on my end, folks, so I'm going to go ahead and just... Doug, can you hear Nathaniel okay?
Hello?
Yeah, Nathaniel, is that you?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, you're on the air, brother. Go ahead. It's all you.
Thank you. I just happened to see Unsettling Territory on Birch Bark Books today, so I thought the coincidence was really great. And also, I think it's wonderful to see a Native person write their own history as a person who's done Native studies as well. So,
Yeah, I totally agree, Nathaniel. Thank you for calling in and sharing that insight. And Doug, I'd like you to comment because again, I think when I read books like yours, I just think, geez, why don't I get off my couch and why don't I write a history, some kind of really compelling historical narrative about my tribe or my community. Um, and what's your advice for folks that are interested in that? Writing about their own histories of their people, and then also just thinking about your own family history and how that all ties into it.
Yeah, I mean, really, in terms of one of your first questions about why family history, and I guess another way to answer that is because it was really the first way that I began to learn my broader tribal history was just through understanding my own family's history, and so I found that a really exciting way to to dive into Native history for the first time, to start asking serious questions about my own family's journey. And in the case of we didn't have archival records in the terms of documents, but I mean we had photographs. My grandmother had decades and decades worth of photographs, and so my interest in Native American history really broadly began with a deep dive into my own family's history. And if I could encourage anyone who's maybe considering doing such things, spend some time with archives anywhere you can find them, just to if you haven't experienced the joy of working with old documents and coming across say family members' names and in historic texts, it's very exciting, and I think it's a relatable way to engage in the broader study, is to see how it all impacts either your family or families like your own.
Doug, we've also got to talk about the fact that this is 2026 and America 250 is on the top of a lot of people's minds right now. And you mention America 250 once in the book. How would you like Americans to acknowledge the Oneida Nation's role in the founding of this country?
What I would hope for Americans to understand is what the relationship that the United States has with Oneidas following the Revolution says about the character of the United States. So Oneidas, along with Tuscaroras, are very reluctant allies to the United States during the Revolutionary War. And initially, it's perceived as a dispute, as a internal civil war, right? And we're very reluctant to engage. But the reality is that the front lines of military contestation are right there in our territory. And despite the fact that the Declaration of Independence calls everyone merciless Indian savages, Oneidas and Tuscaroras still make the decision to lend aid to the Americans. And particular moments such as this famous and historically significant moment in which Washington and his soldiers are suffering at Valley Forge. They're underfed, they're underclothed, and Oneida woman Polly Cooper shows up along with many Oneida men, bringing hundreds of bushels of corn, right? And that was something that got the Revolutionary Army through the winter. And because of that service, George Washington himself promised that Oneidas would never lose possession of our territory in upstate New York. My book is about getting the land back in Wisconsin, right? Not New York. And so those promises did not hold up very long at all. And in fact, certain foreign leaders and supporters, who would return after the revolution, expecting to see Oneidas in upstate New York, were surprised. What happened to our Oneida allies? They've been vacated largely from the territory. Of course, there's a whole community that still remains. But for Americans to understand that, the nature of that relationship went sour quite quickly.
Mm-hmm. Doug, I want to ask you one more question, and then we're going to talk about the next book that we're scheduled to discuss on the show today. And let's talk a little bit about the history of gaming in the Oneida Nation, and specifically, again, going back to the theme in some parts of your book, these really strong, powerful Oneida women. And there were two women in particular you write about, the Bingo Queens. Tell our listeners about the Bingo Queens and why they're such a big part of Oneida contemporary economic development history.
Yeah, I highlight this story, which I borrow the title from another book published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. That to highlight an example of the origins of gaming, in the sense of, I think sometimes there's a sort of passive notion that gaming arrives in Native communities and brings policy change. that we're all just sort of simply waiting for, right? But gaming becomes a reality because people are pushing at the edges, right? People are challenging the nature of the system. And this is one great example where Oneida women get together and really get on board with the idea of expanding the scale of bingo, right? And if churches can use bingo to raise funds, then why can't we do the same thing as a nation? And it begins with the idea of bingo, led by two women, Sandra Bremer and Alma Webster. And it grows and it grows from there, and it eventually leads us to the Oneida Nation Casino that we have today. But it's again, it's not a passive development. It's something that they begin pushing for in the mid 1970s. It's 1976 that they begin advancing high stakes bingo and opening the door to a casino that would come 15 years later.
The book is titled Unsettling Territory, The Resurgence of the Oneida Nation in the Face of Settler Backlash, and the author is Douglas Metoxen Keel. Phone numbers 1-800-99-NATIVE. Give us a call. We took one caller already from Eagle Butte, South Dakota. And let's get another caller going here. I'd like to hear your thoughts from listeners with regard to today's books that we're discussing. And let's now talk about another book. And we have two authors who are joining us to discuss this book. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, we have Dorothy Denetclaw. She is the co-author of The Sons of Gunshooter, a Navajo resistance story. She is Dene. Dorothy, pleasure to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Yes. Thank you.
And joining us from San Diego, California, we have Matt Fitzsimons. He is the co-author of The Sons of Gunshooter, and he is a former journalist. Matt, good morning, and welcome to Native America Calling.
Good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you for having us on.
Well, let's get into this book here. This is another really, really compelling read that we're focusing on today on the show. And Dorothy, I want to begin with you because the narrative in your book, it reflects a story that was told you when you were growing up. How is your story different from how it was portrayed at the time, the story that you've written now?
Okay. A lot of it is based on love and ethical training that my great-great-grandfather got before 1840s. He was raised with it, and then he passed it off to his children, which includes several generations to include me. So the love, ethical training, and all, and the spiritual, the ceremonial practices. He was a medicine man. So all that is what I grew up on. And then the story is, it involves a lot of Western ways. So I just want you to know that my family lived a different life, and they respected everything, nature and all. Yes.
Yeah, Dorothy, and of course your grandfather, his name translates into English. It translated into English as Gunshooter from the Navajo, and his photo is on the cover of your book. He's just such a striking man, just absolutely regal in appearance. And there's also some additional photos of him in the book. Tell me more about your grandfather. Adiltone, am I pronouncing that correctly? I apologize if I'm not.
Yes. Perfect.
Oh, good. That makes me
you
feel so
put
good,
emphasis
Dorothy.
on
Thank
certain one
practiced.
syllable. Yes, he was. He grew up. Well, I'm going to frankly tell you the history if I start doing that. But he was raised with a lot of love, with a lot of by his grandfather, Walachi Jahatale, Red Antway medicine man. He's the one that's the top in my chronological that I have in the book. It talks about him, and then his two sons that he raised, that was given to him, and he raised those two sons, and they were the medicine man. Both of them knew exactly what their father was doing, taught them all the ethical training, and then they had a little girl, the third one child, and then the United States troops rounded the people up, and they went to Fort Sumner. While there, that's when the Gunshooter, well, the little girl grew up and then saw a boy that she liked, and then of course, whatever romance, that's what you call it, but she got to know she was just a child, just barely in her teens, and that's where she got pregnant, still incarcerated at Fort Sumner. And what happens is that baby she carried in her stomach, they had a travel treaty that was, they had a travel treaty made for them. All the kids have to go to school, name it, and then they signed it, and the people were released from there. On their way back, before they got to Fort Wingate, that's where they were headed for. That's many miles, many days. Anyway, the baby was born. That's the picture on the Gunshooter, that he was born. And then from there, his grandfather that was his first grandchild. So he just babied him and took him back to Gray Mountain near Flagstaff.
Okay. We're going to take another break. We'll come back. We'll continue this conversation. And what I think is so cool is I'm out here broadcasting live from Hopi Radio, Second Mesa, and so many of the places that are written about in this book, The Sons of Gunshooter, Ganado, Arizona, Dilcon, Keams Canyon. I'm right here. I'm experiencing it. Stay with us.
Support from Rodale, publisher of A Feather and a Fork, 125 Intertribal Dishes from an Indigenous Food Warrior by Crystal Wapipa with Amy Page Condon, and a foreword by Tommy Orange is now available for purchase wherever books are sold.
Need an actionable plan to achieve your goals? Kaufman & Associates strengthens Native organizations through culturally grounded strategic planning. More at kaufmaninc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
We're glad you're with us today on Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce, and we're adding to our Native bookshelf today. We got a perspective on the strength of the Oneida Nation from Doug Keel, and now we're learning about a point in history from the Navajo Nation through the lens of a murder case in the early 1900s. Listeners can join us at 1-800-996-2848. Let's talk with the co-author of The Sons of Gunshooter, Matt Fitzsimons. And Matt, earlier we heard from Dorothy about her family's rich and strong history in connection to this story. But the book also intertwines the family of another group of people, the Hubbles. And they were a wealthy trading family in the Southwest. In fact, their marks are still in this part of the country. You still hear the name used frequently. Tell us more about who the Hubbles were and what was the importance of these trading posts that they had operating throughout the Southwest?
Yes, thank you. Thanks again for having us on. I love that you're right there, Sean, while we're having this conversation. It's really neat. I think you can probably see some of the physical landmarks from where you're at. So the Hubbles were originally my interest. Before I met Dorothy, I was researching this sort of gap between the myth and the reality surrounding Hubble Trading Post. And for those who don't know, Hubble Trading Post was established in the 1870s, and today it's a National Historic Site operated by the National Park Service in the town of Ganado, Arizona, on the Great Navajo Nation. And as you mentioned, the Hubbles were this prominent and very politically connected family of traders. And I had always read that they were generous and kind, and in books and magazine articles, they were portrayed as these paragons of multiculturalism. And while researching a previous book on the Long Walk and the forced exile of the Navajos, I was surprised to come across the Hubble name again and again in the archives, connected to some of the worst atrocities of that period. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting disconnect between the popular narrative and what appeared to be reality. So I started following a few of those threads of Hubble history, and one of them led me to Dorothy. And the connection, of course, was the trading post. where in 1919, Charlie Hubble, the brother of the most significant trader, J.O. Hubble, was shot to death. And two of Dorothy's uncles were arrested. And so I reached out to her, and Dorothy had been sharing her history for years through Leading the Way magazine, as well as the Navajo Times. And so I had seen a little article the Times had done, just a few paragraphs many years back. And so I reached out to that reporter, got a hold of Dorothy, and it took me about 5 minutes of talking to Dorothy for her to totally transform my thinking, because her family story is so epic. I mean, just absolutely amazing. And Gunshooter, in addition to being this prominent medicine man, was a silversmith and a horse wrangler, and then became one of the first police officers in the Loop extension of the reservation, and a judge and the liaison with the federal government there. And her family has triumphed over all these adversities and injustices, not just once or twice, but over and over again across all these generations. So I found that remarkable. So I think while it is, as you said, a tale of two families, I think it's the story of Dorothy's family that people will find most meaningful in the end.
Matt, you also described the Hubbles enslaving Navajo people and other Native Americans, and this is many years after the end of the Civil War. How was it possible for them to keep slaves after the practice had long since been abolished?
Yeah, I mean, only now are we really talking about it, right? I mean, it's only been in the last 15, 20 years that there have been books coming out really taking a serious look at the indigenous slave trade. My first book was a look at the role of the slave trade in corrupting U.S. policy and personnel in the run-up to the war. And it did. They passed the Peonage Act in 1867 that was meant to eliminate the indigenous slave trade in the Southwest, but it really didn't. And, you know, one of the claims about the Hubbles and J.O. Hubble was that he was so open. Look what a great job he did learning the Navajo language. And one of the things we suggest is it's most likely he learned those language from the women and children that were enslaved on his family's ranch when he grew up in New Mexico. And they continued to be enslaved there. We found in the census records as late as the 1880s, so a full 20 years after the end of the Civil War. So,
okay.
Yeah, an important part of history that's been overlooked, and it's good it's getting that attention now.
Absolutely. And I definitely want to talk more about the killing of Charles Hubble. But before that, there's just one more issue I want to talk about the Hubble family. And you write about Santiago Hubble. And what he did is he actually charged a toll. I couldn't believe this. This just blew my mind. Charged a toll for Navajo people walking from Fort Sumner to Fort Wingate. I mean, what does that say about this family, Matt? I don't get these people, really.
You know, that was the episode that I came across in the archives that most blew my mind in the early period. And it was like, how has this never been documented? Because I think it says everything, that after everything the Navajos had gone through, when they finally secured their release and they're heading home, he rode out, he intercepted them at the Rio Puerco, the whole 10-mile caravan, and he demanded from the U.S. Army a toll. And he put a toll on every person, every sheep, and every horse that wanted to get across. And the river was in full flood stage at that time. And what was more striking was to find out that he had lost his own brother in a river crossing a few years earlier. So he fully was aware of the danger down below. And yet, with one last chance to profit off the Navajos before they returned home from exile, he rode out there trying to get it. He finally let them go only when the Army explained they didn't have any money and they wrote him an IOU. And he spent years afterwards trying to collect. He never got the money, though.
Jeez. Okay, let's hear some audio now. This is George Nell's voice. He is the man who spent 12 years in prison for the shooting death of Charles Hubble, and he is one of the sons of Gunshooter. It's an interview from 1961. This was decades after he was released from prison. And the authors of the book discovered the audio at the Smithsonian Institution. The interviewer is from the University of Utah, asking about building a hogan, a traditional Navajo home. And Nell speaks in the Navajo language. And I do apologize, the quality of this audio might be a little bit hard to hear, but it's so important to listen to. Let's take a listen here now.
This is the statement of George Nell's number 200, statement number 200, continued taken at Window Rock, Arizona on the 2nd of June, 1961 by J. Lee Correll. The interpreter is Maxwell Yaji.
In the old days, you said the Navajos always cut new wood for a hogan. Did they ever cut dead timbers or pick up dead logs to use in the new hogan?
That was audio from author Dorothy Dennett-Claw's uncle George Nels, 1961. The recording was uncovered during research of the book we're discussing today, titled The Sons of Gunshooter, which is out now by the University of Arizona Press. And Dorothy, I want to go back to you and ask him, what's it like for you hearing your uncle's voice in that recording all these years later? And also tell me more about George Nels and the impact that this murder trial had on your uncles.
My uncle was raised as all the children of Gunshooter. They were raised with a lot of love, and he taught them, he showed them, they participated in the ceremonial. Anything that they did, helping people to heal, they were there. They understood, and what they were, in addition, they were told that this is how you do it, this is the way you talk to people, this is the way you treat people, and all of the ethical training went along with it. And respect for Mother Nature, all of it went together. So when he went to prison and then he was released and came back, that people he continued that what he was taught as a child. As he grew up, he continued to be a medicine man, and he went, and the community elected him as a council delegate in 1940s, or maybe around the late in 1830s. He was released in 1931. So 1940s is when he was, for sure, he was on the Navajo Tribal Council. And he continued to help people. He continued to set up a blacksmith shop that was approved by the council for him. We have the documents and everything, but he continued to help the people. He continued his ways. He didn't have any. He traveled all over. He had a lot of stories to tell, and he continued the practice. He knew that he was a medicine man, so he continued his work. He didn't just leave it.
Dorothy, I just want to thank you for taking the initiative and sharing this history, your family story, with readers, because this is priceless. These accounts are absolutely priceless. Just thank you so much. And Matt, I want to go back to you because the reporting from newspapers on the Hubble killing were wrong from the very beginning. What did you learn about the misinformation regarding this case?
Well, it was biased from the start, but, I'm a former newspaper guy, and I don't want to be too hard on the newspaper guy because all the books ever since have been even more biased, I'd argue. We had some great launch events on the Navajo Nation at Window Rock and at Loop Elementary School, and in those I brought along 3 other books that over the years had discussed the case, and they were all wildly inaccurate, and they all gave wildly conflicting account to what happened. There was no way to even reconcile what the three different authors were saying, and with each other or with the facts. And I think that's kind of par for the course of a lot of the history that has been biased. And that's why I think it's so important for Dorothy and in your previous guest, you were talking about the need for more Native authors to step up and tell their stories and share their stories. And I think that's critical, partly because the stories are so inspiring and we all benefit from hearing them, but also to correct the historical record, because it's been biased for 150 years and it's time to straighten it out.
Mm-hmm. Matt, tell me about how you were able to reconstruct the trial and what ultimately happened to Gunshooter's sons.
Yes, well, ultimately, they, as Dorothy said, they returned home and returned to their lives and returned to their ways. But it was a great injustice that was done. You know, the trial was a murder trial, but what we put out was self-defense, and that's what the family had contended from the beginning. And what I liked about this opportunity is, as a newspaper reporter, I covered a lot of criminal cases in the past. And criminal cases, there's a lot of documentation that surrounds them. And so it gives us a chance to kind of look beyond what books had said and to actually dive into what really happened. And so we were able to find a lot of records, both through the courts and through the prison system. And really importantly, there was some tension, a great deal of conflict between the federal government and Arizona on how to handle the case and what really happened. And by finding the federal records and digging them out of the archives in Washington, we were able to corroborate what Dorothy's family has been saying for 100 years.
And Matt, we've got to wrap up the show here shortly, but I do want to ask you about what this means to the legacy of the Hubble family, because again, their handprints are everywhere in this part of the country. Hubble Trading Post is a national historic site. They're even aligned with the National Parks Conservation Association. What do listeners need to really understand here? Because again, it's, you know, the history to this point has been so favorable of the Hubbles.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. You know, somebody else asked, what do you make of Hubble Trading Post at this point? I love Hubble Trading Post. I love visiting there. I love the whole area. The countryside's gorgeous. The art is incredible, and it's unbelievable. You can walk in and people in the community are still coming in and speaking Navajo and purchasing goods. I mean, there's not a place like it anywhere in the national park system. And I think if we focus on the community and we focus on the art, then it's an incredible story. The problem is the signage right now. It's all about the Hubbles and telling their story and telling this kind of mythical story of how wonderful they were. But if there's the signage on the walls, and then there's the rangers giving the tours. And most people, I think, are listening to the rangers and going on the tours. And the rangers already center their story to a great extent around the community and around the artists. And so I think, it's just a matter of shifting the focus. And if you focus on those things, look what we have to celebrate. After all this time, the art is still here, the people are still there, the community's still there, and the Hubbles are gone.
Wow, really something to think about here. We're out of time. We're going to have to wrap up this conversation, unfortunately. But I want to thank our three guests who joined us, authors Matt Fitzsimons, Dorothy Denetclaw, and Doug Keel. Hope you enjoyed this show. And if you'd like to comment, share some thoughts, again, you can go to our Facebook page, our Instagram, Blue Sky Threads, or our website, NativeAmericaCalling.com. And we'll be back tomorrow for a conversation with Inuk activist, lawyer, musician, and fashion designer Ayu Peter. And I'll be back in the Albuquerque studio. So hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk again soon.
Tribal Development Partners believe strong infrastructure strengthens tribal sovereignty. Through the 105L lease program, TDP helps align federal funding systems with long-term tribal priorities. More at tribaldevpartners.com. Proud to support this show.
Support from Davis Keelan Law Firm, a New Mexico firm standing with Native families suffering catastrophic loss. When tragedy strikes Indian country, Davis Keelan fights to restore stability, dignity, and justice, bringing a voice to Native families and communities for 20 years. More information, daviskeelan.com.
Who protects Indian country? Amerind does. As the only 100% tribally owned insurance carrier, Amerind helps strengthen tribal communities by providing reliable insurance coverage and keeping dollars in Indian country. From property and liability to commercial auto and tribal workers' compensation, Amerind is here to protect what matters. Celebrating 40 years of serving Indian country. Learn more at amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Quantic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.